Artist Talks. My name is Sydney Purcell, and I am the curator for public practice at the Spencer Museum of Art. I hope that if you have not seen the exhibition yet, My Mother's Tongue Ties Me Together, that you will join us across the street after these talks for a reception. We'll have some snacks and treats, and we can celebrate all three artists. I've been lucky enough to work with Mary, Hung, and Noelle since February of this year. We've been working. That's when they received the award. This is a juried process, these artist awards through Charlotte Street. They're merit-based, so each artist gets a show at a prominent art museum or gallery usually within the Kansas City area, but this is the first time that the Spencer Museum of Art has hosted the show. Kansas, which also made Douglas County residents eligible for the award. Mary, Hung, and Noelle were all selected this year, and all of the work that you're going to see in their presentations was between February or early March when you found out that you received it, and when we installed the exhibitions over the summer. So it was quite a feat. I cannot believe you all made this much work in that short of time, and I'm really excited to hear more about their process in each of their presentations. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Charlotte Street, who is here as well, partnering with us, and we'll get it started because I know we might go over time a little bit. We have some time built in for Q&A, but so we will start with Mary. Please help me welcome Mary to the podium.
Hi everybody, can you hear me okay? Okay, I want to thank everybody for being here today. And to start off, I want to thank everybody who has made this exhibition possible. So first I want to thank Hung and Noelle, my fellow artists in the exhibition. We did it. It's been such an honor to show alongside you guys and see the dedication that you put into your work, into your practice. I would also like to thank Charlotte Street Foundation and the jury, and to Sarah Lynn and the Spencer Museum and the entire team over there for making this opportunity possible, and for all of your support. Thank you so much to Sydney for curating and coordinating this exhibition. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you to the entire installation team for helping us get everything up in the museum. Thank you to my workplace associates and friends, Cooper, Ricky, and Joe, for your technical consulting. Thank you most of all to my partner, Mitch, for all of your emotional, mental, and most of all, physical support. Lucky to have you. And I'd also like to thank my parents for all of their support and for taking a chance and coming to this country almost 30 years ago. So to begin, I'd like to read you an abridged version of a dialectic that I wrote. It kind of takes the form of a tea ceremony, and it explains some of the philosophical underpinnings of my work and my practice. And I'll come back to this throughout the talk. There implicitly lies a distinction between space and place. While both are components of our mutually lived world, the former sits in the a priori abstract, while the latter is delineated and retained a posteriori. Space is external and pure, and of an existence that is in and of itself. Space can be regarded as metaphysical scaffolding whose existence extends exterior to time, where human experience may orient itself upon, so that place can persist as a subjective, empirical concept derived from experience. Space allows for the understanding of that which is distinct from ourselves and our internality. Take a saucer and place it on the table. So this first piece that I'd like to talk about is called Apologue, Verso from Within the Cave. So I have a degree in philosophy from my undergraduate institution. I joke that it's the peak of my assimilation into Western culture. So, when I was an undergrad, I was studying Kantian metaphysics, and this is when I started introducing sound into my practice. And I was also bartending at punk venues in the evening, so just, a little bit of background. So the title of this piece is a reference to Plato's allegory of the cave. In the allegory, Plato speaks about prisoners who are being chained inside to face a wall in the cave, and all they see are the shadows passing by the cave walls. So they believe these shadows to be true reflections of reality, because it's all that they know. One prisoner becomes free, and she enters outside of the cave and realizes that the shadows were just mere reflections of actual objects and things given by the sun. So she goes back into the cave to tell the other prisoners, but they reject her advances of enlightening them and freeing them. In the allegory, Plato is likening this freed prisoner to a philosopher and the role of a philosopher. So when I was making this piece, I was thinking about my own role in the allegory and kind of how it relates to this whole piece. And I don't think that I'm the prisoner, and I don't think that I'm the philosopher in this situation. I think in this piece, I'm trying to position myself as the sun. And I actually do this a lot in my works. I pretend to be the sun because of my last name. But my last name actually isn't Sun, it's Sun. And Sun in Chinese means grandson, which I'm also not. But in the Chinese Romanized alphabet, Sun is spelled the same as sun, and I was a really shy child, so I never corrected anybody in the mispronunciation of my name. So my last name now is Sun, and in my work, I pretend to be the sun. Apolog is a multi-channel sound installation that utilizes feedback as its main sounding source. And so I work a lot with feedback in my work. And you might be most familiar with feedback as that high-pitched screaming sound that you hear when you get a microphone too close to a speaker. Feedback is a positive feedback loop that happens when there is a direct path between an audio input and an audio output. And so I utilize that simple system to generate sounds, specifically in this piece. And the resulting frequency of that feedback is determined by the resonance frequency of the microphone, of the speaker, of the amplifier, and of the overall space. So in Apolog, formally, these sculptural components are referencing Platonic solids. The shells are also a reference to Plato's physical cave. But from a physics standpoint, the cones are acting as amplifiers, and they're helping to funnel all of the sound to the microphones that are in the smaller apertures. The cement shells are acting as resonating bodies, and the pitch of the feedback is determined by the size and the shape of the shells, as well as the size of the cones and the distance between the cone and the shell. And all of that is also tuned through a computer program. I program most of my work using Max MSP. So the feedback is something that is actually highly, highly sensitive, and it's really responsive to the space around it. So also the placement of people's bodies and the introduction of their voices introduces new harmonics and frequencies into the system. So it's constantly generating new sounds and responding to everybody physically in the space. And in that sense, feedback is really democratic because it affects everybody equally. I'm going to show you some documentation from a larger system of Apolog that I did. And in this system, there's also transducers attached to the outer shells in the system. So those shells are being vibrated and sounded, and the feedback from those are pitched down. Channels is another feedback sculpture, and this piece generates musical compositions from this two-well system. So sounds that are captured inside of one well is resonating from the speakers of the other and vice versa. So this piece is a conceptual feedback loop. The wells are always listening to each other to create generative tones, and all of the pitches in this are tuned to a pentatonic scale, which is a common standard in Eastern music. In this body of work, I was imagining the wells as tunnels or portals that are connecting me here back to my homeland. At the base of each well is a casted parabolic sound reflector, and this is bouncing the sound waves that enter the well back up to the foci point, which is the single point where the microphone is being suspended. The bricks of the wells are made from smashing and reincorporating my past work, specifically the shells from Apolog, as aggregate into the concrete mix. So I've been trying to introduce some more sustainability into my sculptural practice by reincorporating old materials and thinking about material history and material past lives. This documentation that I'm going to show you is from my first iteration of channels. It was shown in Ways of Listening, curated by Kimi Katada at Charlotte Street Gallery. I'm also going to talk through a couple other iterations of channels that I've shown since then. So in this second iteration, it's called Channels Tunneling Home. And inside the walls is the voice of my mom singing Chinese lullabies from my childhood, and they occasionally play from alternating wells. And so that's the impetus of the compositions in this iteration. This piece was a eulogy to my late grandfather, with whom I lived in China. He raised me when my parents first moved to the States, and these were lullabies that he would sing to me to lull me to sleep. The wells in this iteration are tuned to harmonize with my mom's voice. And the third iteration of channels is called Where the Waters Meet, and this is the most recent iteration that was shown this past summer at Smack Mellon in Brooklyn, New York, and this was a part of Remains to be Seen, curated by Pallavi Sarana. This iteration contained field recordings from two different bodies of water. The first body of water is the Hunhe, which is a lake in Shenyang, China, which is my hometown. And the other body of water is the salt marshes outside of Brooklyn, which is right by Smack Mellon. Thank you to my friend Danny Dobkin for recording those sounds. So in this iteration, I was imagining, maybe a drop of water from the Hunhe traveling all the way across spans of seas to reach the salt marshes in Brooklyn. So kind of like a migration story. And the compositions of this is built from the physical auditory blending of these two bodies of water that are on distinct sides of the planet. A site is a destination that occupies space and contains the capacity for place, so long as that potentiality remains indentured to a fragment of time. Take an empty teacup and place it in the saucer. There is an aspect of limited temporality to a site. A construction site can only remain that so long as it continues to be constructed upon. Once that which is being built is completed, the site surrenders its position and becomes superseded by place. A site is the ghost of a place. It is a fragment of space that is, was, or will be bound to place. Notice how the teacup rests in the saucer. I lost my sight specificity when I moved to the States, and in my attempts to differentiate, I have drawn nearer to here and further from my motherland. This next piece that I would like to talk about is called Wayward Bridge, Westward Sun, and this is a sound installation that invited viewers to walk across the system of bridges. So the bridges are designed to look like they're partially submerged into the floor, so it's a circular bridge system that's kind of dipping underground and coming back up. So maybe the floor is a horizon line that's splitting the east and the west. When participants are walking on the bridges, the sound of their footsteps is being modulated live to sound as if they're walking in water. And this is like a reversal of bridge logic, because normally when you're on the bridge, you're out of the water. The footsteps are also simultaneously being recorded on a sound-on-sound loop that is being played circularly around the system of bridges. So there are 20 speakers in the system, and those speakers are in 20 of the pipes that go around the bridge. So the length of the pipes is also physically modulating and pitching the sounds. The idea of this piece came from the circularity of traveling east to go west. This funny thing happens when you're an immigrant. You're considered an outsider when in the country that you have moved to, and when you go back to the country that you're from, you're also considered a foreigner. And it begins to raise this question of just simply, where can I find the allowance to be where I am? What begins as undifferentiated space becomes place as we get to know it better and endow it with value. The ideas space and place require each other for definition. From the security and stability of place, we are aware of the openness, freedom, and threat of space, and vice versa. Furthermore, if we think of space as that which allows movement, then place is pause. Each pause in movement makes it possible for location to be transformed into place. Place is security, and space is freedom. We are attached to the one and long for the other. There is no place like home. What is a home? Place is a vessel for memory and desire, physically bound to and contained in space. Pour yourself some tea. Place is defined by a conscious articulation that resides internally within the self. In my practice, I construct compositional infrastructures to transform space into site into place. With sculptural constructs, I delineate a site from its surrounding space. Then through the introduction of sound-facilitated audience interaction, the site transforms into place. Sound acts as the passageway for human subjectivities and interactions to enter and occupy the constructed site, so that each individual may placemake among the work. This next piece is called Wayfaring Stranger. Wayfaring Stranger is a sound walk that uses FM radio transmission to create a navigable soundscape that the audience can explore. This was installed in upstate New York. So the audience can take a radio receiver and walk through these different zones of transmission that are all being broadcasted to the same frequency. So as one zone of transmission dissolves into static, another one takes shape. On one of these transmissions is historical renderings of an American folk song called Poor Wayfaring Stranger. This is a Civil War era song, and it has an indeterminate origin. Historical records indicate that the song might have been derived from Black Sorrow songs that allude to finding freedom in the North. Another speculated theory is that the song had traveled to America with a German immigrant and was adopted into the early 19th century folk song repertoire. And there's also evidence that maybe the song was descended from a Scottish border ballad. And the artists that I included in that track are Burl Ives, Stan Wilson, and Ann Southern. There's another transmission in this piece that consists of synthesized and modulated starling calls that have all been pitched to the tune of Wayfaring Stranger. And the third transmission consists of modulated and synthesized finch calls over field recordings taken in New York. So both of these bird species are considered highly invasive now, despite being brought to New York back in the 19th century for aesthetic reasons. So starlings were brought to the US as a part of this effort to bring in all of the bird species that were mentioned in Shakespeare's plays to America. So 100 of them were released in Central Park, and now there are over 200 million starlings in North America. And in 1940, a small number of finches were released in Long Island after a failed attempt of selling them as caged birds. And now they are overpopulated also in the US. And I use these bird species as a metaphor for immigrant and migrant populations in the US and the treatment and discrimination towards them. So as the audience is navigating across this soundscape, they too become a wayfaring stranger, and they're moving along the voices of immigrant, migrant, and displaced voices. I immigrated to the States when I was 3. As an immigrant, I felt as if I've been reared in the crevice between two countries, caught on the sill of the liminal in the space between fragmented cultural identities. I've traveled east to go west, said west and gone east, only to be identified as a foreign body once more. How many revolutions is one to take before finding an instance of home? Take a sip of tea. I catch glimpses of home inside the box that remains unpacked in the corner of my apartment, the box that patiently awaits the annual migration, the box that is ferried from building to building, site to site, the box that is carried but never opened. Take another sip. My practice is the carrying of boxes that do not open. It is the process of digging, filling, and re-excavating holes. It is the stacking and unstacking of bricks to temporarily define place within outer space. It is the act of traveling east to go west to find the end of a story that is stuck in the shape of a circle. Sip and pour yourself some more tea. So Mitch and I just signed the lease renewal for the house that we're living in now. And this is the first time that I've ever signed a lease renewal. So this is the first time in over a decade that I've lived in the same place for more than a year, which is really crazy to think about. To conclude my talk, I'd like to talk about one of the pieces that's across the street over at the Spencer right now. It's called In the Tempest Through the Eaves, and this is the large sculptural installation. So this is an interactive sound installation that references my ancestral past through the language of historic Chinese architecture. The dogong bracketing system that is being referenced in these sculptures have been used for millennia in China, and they're built to withstand strong storms and earthquakes. So these are traditionally timber-framed elements, and they help connect like the vertical columns and the horizontal beams in these structures. And because they use no static fasteners, the friction fit joints work really well to dispel any kind of seismic activity because there's some flexibility there, so they're able to offset that energy and dissipate the movement. I recreated these structures using concrete because I was imagining maybe a calcification or petrification process that might happen when you take something from its place of origin and you transplant it to elsewhere. So whenever a person walks near these sculptures, the sound is activated, and the sound is derived from data taken from earthquakes nearby the locations that I've lived since I was born. So there's one earthquake for every year that I've been alive. I took the waveforms of the seismographs and I translated them into sound waves, and those are being transduced through gongs that are hanging on the tops of the tiles. The tiles themselves are a reference to traditional Chinese curved shingles, and each of these tiles was formed on a different part of my body while the clay was still wet. So they're irregular in shape, but that irregularity allows for extra movement when they're being vibrated. The tiles are acting as disembodied plate armor, sheltering what's below while still carrying the impression of my form. And there's patterns of auspicious clouds that have been imprinted to the tops of these tiles, taken from ancient Chinese textiles. And there's also impressions of rice that have been pressed into the bottoms of the tiles and burned out through the firing process. And so these serve as wayfinding markers, with the clouds pointing to the sky and the grain pointing to the ground. And so this body of work is the first body of work that I've made that is outwardly referencing my Chinese heritage, like it looks Chinese. And for a long time, I was evading and obfuscating my immigrant identity. But, I've come to understand over the years that that's not something to run away from, and it's not something that you can hide. The work in the museum is a collision of structures of my past with storms of my present, and this piece in total weighs over 3,000 pounds. It was really important for this work to be monumental and for it to be heavy, because who I am and where I come from isn't something to be taken lightly. And through this work, I hope to be able to encourage people to build past their fears and move towards what intimidates them. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, up next we have Hùng Lê.
Today, I'm really excited to share a little bit more about my practice with you all. I'm going to kind of go in a chronological order because that's just how kind of my brain works with time. And so a lot of my practice can be summarized up as an obsession with memory. I'm really interested in how we as people remember things through kind of photographs, artifacts, and other objects comparatively to how our collective memory is formulated through education, archives, and other kind of institutions. I originally got really interested in fiber through garments. I thought I was going to be a fashion designer, but then I made one garment, and then I realized that I did not like making garment for other people. And so I really just kind of started to kind of look at them myself. But I was really interested in ways in which people would adorn themselves and how the perception of people would change depending on what they wore. Which led me to really researching the American War in Vietnam and kind of depiction of Vietnamese bodies within Hollywood through films like Apocalypse Now, Rambo, and all that stuff, where the kind of agency of Vietnamese people was removed by their kind of removal of their clothing, and only the indicator would be like a conical hat or something like that. So this led me to really start researching the kind of process of dehumanizing a person during war in order to commit the act of killing and how much it has to kind of remove yourself from the process. But as I realized I was consuming so much images of my family members or people that look like my family members and my loved ones dying over and over and over again, and I realized that I myself started to become really desensitized to the images themselves and started to flip them really, really quickly. So as a result, I kind of stepped back and kind of delved back into the personal archive as both a way to kind of mentally ground myself, but also kind of give a number, a name, a face, and a story to all these numbers that I was reading. And I really do believe that our brain does not have the capacity to really realize how big these numbers are when we say millions and thousands of deaths. And so it was like a way for me to both introduce myself back into the work, but also kind of make a sustainable practice in a way. Junior year in college, I took a indigo dyeing class with Kim Eckler-Messmer, and that changed the trajectory of my practice. So much of what indigo and my kind of interest in it, I can't really explain. Something clicked in my brain when I touched it. And I really do think it is the closest thing we have to magic. I think the process of it itself, the transformation of it, and also the capacity of it to kind of develop independently in so many parts of the world, and in so many methods of extracting the dyes itself. So I started to kind of really combine these indigo processes with laser engraving. I was really interested in kind of image making techniques, and for some reason, every single time I screen printed, it never came out the way that I wanted. And so the laser engraver was something that I had already been using and kind of practicing with, but never really merged with fabric. But I really love this kind of dynamic of using a process in order to burn something away, in order to memorialize it. So much of the kind of act of burning is seen as an act of destruction and the kind of information that gets lost with it. After I graduated, I got the Wingate Lamar Fellowship, which allowed me to travel back to Vietnam for 3 months to do a research trip, which was kind of one of the first time, if not the first time, that I went back to Vietnam by myself, which came with its own kind of, a lot of kind of self-identity and questionings within it. I spent so much time in my hometown documenting the places that I had grown up around and the kind of changes that had occurred where it feels familiar, but I felt like I was kind of an outlier once again. Everywhere I went, I was like a sore thumb, and people knew about me before I even knew about them. And one of the major kind of point of the fellowship was taking an indigo workshop in northern Cao Bang with the Nong An women. And I feel like this was when indigo really started to take its own shape and identity and form by itself. Working with them, I was introduced to the process from start to finish. I was plowing the land, seeding, and then also harvesting it. And the sense of community that indigo was able to bring for this group of women was something that I really gravitated towards. There was such a ritualistic part of the indigo process away from the kind of academic of the way that we were supposed to do it that I gravitated towards. One of the things that I kind of picked up was, so whenever you dyed indigo, you're supposed to kind of bring the water out underneath it and try to extract as much as possible so you're not causing ripple because it disturbs the water surface. But when I did that in Vietnam and I was wringing it about away from the vat because you don't want to make a ripple, the women pushed it back and they were like, no, that's really holy and sacred water. You don't want to waste it. And the way that they also talk about the indigo vat, like it's in kind of its own entity in terms of, is it sick? Is it healthy? Is it feeling warm? In the winter, they would make these little skirts that they would put around the kind of vat. And I think those kind of intuition also has a lot of scientific because indigo likes really warm weather and that's how it activates itself. And so that has a kind of cause in itself. And so I just wanted to share some images of the indigo making process. It still kind of both like intrigues and freaks me out at the same time every single time I look at it because it's just so beautiful, but it's also kind of bodily in a way. And the process of it is just so beautiful. So I can talk about indigo forever. But one of the things that I ran into that I thought was really interesting dynamically was the language barrier. A lot of the women in the community spoke the Nung language and then also Vietnamese, but my Vietnamese is very limited. And so we had a teacher that was kind of guiding us through this whole time. Her name is Tao, and she spoke English, but it was a really interesting translation of some of the time they would just go into their backyard and pick up these plants that they have utilized and used throughout their life. And I was like, what is that? And they would have to think about it in the Nung language, translating it back to English or Vietnamese, and then translating it back to English. And there was a lot of kind of misconnection, and there are so many ingredients that I just never got the name of, but I wrote it down in Nung, and I still can't quite pinpoint what they are. One of the kind of major thing that I encountered within my travels as I was visiting various museums and galleries were brown ceramics ware, also known as gốm nâu. These ceramics were made and kind of overlooked for the longest time because they were thought of as derivative of blue porcelain ware, and so they weren't giving the attention. But I was really interested in the motifs and pattern, and I started to kind of break them down as a kind of mimicry of this kind of culture and the craft that was before it. During that same time, I stumbled upon a huge family archive that my grandfather had kept in this kind of attic and storage when he left Vietnam, and it had photos of my parents and grandparents and my uncles and aunts when they were kids, and I have never seen them before, there was always this gap within my memory that my parents were always 19 and up. They were never children. And so seeing them as kid was such a kind of weird and odd experience, but very like beautiful in many ways. But a lot of the images were also images that my aunt had collected and kind of took when she left Vietnam and fled to America, and then sent back to my grandfather. And so there was this really interesting dynamic of me taking these photos that were originally from America and then bringing it back to America to work with. So I essentially started creating and merging these images and patterns together to kind of talk about this kind of unknown craft history that I encountered versus this kind of unknown art family archive. And there's this kind of interesting dynamic of a recreation of a photo. I think in my head, it feels like time traveling, where I'm never going to be able to reach that moment but by spending time and intentional time and slowing, by stitching and working with it, I feel like I'm also talking to them and being transported back into it. And the stitching I do is very consistent, so it feels like this is my mark left in time, and that's kind of my presence into it. And one of the concepts that I was really thinking about, and I want to share with you guys, is Tinti Mintaz's concept of speaking nearby. This was from a conversation. She never really describes it in whole because she's kind of ambiguous in her own practice, and I kind of like that. But so this is about speaking nearby. In other words, a speaking that does not objectify, does not point to an object as if it's distant from the speaking subject or absent from the speaking place. A speaking that reflects on itself and can come very close to the subject without, however, seizing or claiming it. A speaking in brief, whose closures are only possible moments of transition and open up to other possible moments of transitions. And I think that really shifted the way that I thought about my work. A lot of my work before, I was really conceptual in the sense that this is what it meant and this is what it had to be, and I had to kind of articulate that in some way. But I think after kind of thinking about this concept of nearby, I start to think about my work as more of an iteration and a possibility, but never quite the answer. So it has the capacity to kind of transform and remove itself from it. So I started to kind of look at veiling, weddings and funerals as kind of these rituals, but also using the patterns as veils themselves. One of the kind of dynamic that I was really interested in is showing bodies of colors within the art world. Sometimes it feels very tokenism, and so I wanted a way to kind of push back and ask the audience to either spend more time with the images and kind of consider what they're looking at and not consume it at such a rapid rate. And so I started to really condense the pattern and then also make it really more chaotic in many capacity, but also allow the laser engraver to do its own thing. I've worked with the laser engraver for almost 4 or 5 years now, and every single time I get on it, it feels like I'm learning all over again. I can have a perfect image of what I want it to be, but the laser will kind of edit and obscure it just because of the tension or just kind of the elevation of the fabric flowing throughout of it. Which also led me to thinking about more of an implied presence rather than showing the body. The image you see on the right is the image that I wanted to print. In terms of the kind of figures and everything, I added a little bit of additional pattern, but when it went through the laser engraver, the figures themselves started to disappear, but the pattern stayed really consistently. And this was a project that I was on a deadline for, and so I couldn't just go back and dyed all these things and then also laser engrave them again. And so it was an opportunity to kind of practice this concept of speaking nearby and releasing a level of agency, where it feels like this was a collaboration between me, the indigo, the laser engraver, and then also my grandparents that are in the photos. And so as a way, I started to kind of articulate more of the veil and kind of use that as a way to imply the presence. Which leads me to kind of the current body of work that you guys see at the museum. One of the things that I really struggled with when I was in my undergrad was making the work too legible for an audience that I wasn't sure who I was making it for. And so I felt like I was being very obvious in many capacities and kind of catering it to a certain audience. And it wasn't until I had an artist talk with an Asian professor that she was like, Hung, this is almost too obvious. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting that I didn't even have to explain a lot of things, and there are nuances that were picked up. And so I really wanted to lean into this confusion within the new bodies of work and kind of obscuring the bodies themselves. But another component of it was the writing system that I kind of started to think about. Vietnamese and English are structurally very similar to one another, except the accent mark. And so essentially what I've did is essentially broke them down into these pixels and think of them as pattern and then morph them back together in order to create these kind of coded motifs. And it's funny because I have a hard time reading these coded motifs sometimes. And so in a way, it may also kind of like outliers me as also an audience. And for this piece specifically, my grandfather was a big person with photography and documenting and also archiving. He was also a very creative person. And the kind of show really centers around kind of three characters, my grandfather, my grandmother, and then my uncle. My grandfather and my uncle passed away earlier in the year. And so there was this really interesting dynamic that I was kind of trying to work through. And so this is a writing that my grandfather had left on the back of the image of the moment that my grandmother was walking into the house during their wedding. And so I essentially translated that back over into these kind of embroideries and kind of collaborated with him in many ways. The other central kind of figures within my work was my uncle. He was the first person that passed away in our family in the United States, and before then I never really felt like the United States was my home. But I kind of remember vividly whenever he was buried that I was like, oh my God, I have like a stake here, like a physicality here that I can't remove myself from anymore. And so this was the kind of the first piece that came out of this kind of body of work that I was thinking about. And the title is Người bạn cho một đường dài, which essentially translates to a friend for the long road. And I think about my uncle kind of like in this other place rather than like the afterlife or something where he's just in a very far distant kind of like country that I can't reach. And in that many capacity, I think time collapses on itself and it kind of circulates in many capacity. And this is one of the pieces I did not use a lot of red embroidery or white embroidery. It was just kind of blue in general. And I think this is one of the first all blue piece, which felt really kind of odd, but I like the kind of push and pull that it creates and the density of the pattern within it. At the same time, I was also questioning a lot of the religious beliefs that I was kind of surrounded by through these rituals as I was going through the funerary processes, and kind of thinking about what makes a person worth remembering in a religious aspect. I was thinking a lot about saints and sainthood and what deemed them as kind of like these icons in many ways that we should remember for a really long time. And so I kind of, in a way, turned my grandfather and my uncle into saints as these people that I talk to a lot. And so this kind of phrase that I want to share with you guys, it says, from the top to bottom, it says, prayers couldn't save you then, prayers won't save me now. And so I was really dealing with this kind of push and pull of how much I wanted to show and share the work and versus how much I wanted to keep to myself. And then the last kind of physical piece within the exhibition is called Nam Chat Lại Một Lần Cuối, and it represents my grandfather. He passed away from stroke, and he was bedridden for 13 years, and he was the tallest person in our family also. And so you see all the grandkids really, really tall, but no one else is. And so there's always this question of like, where did you get your height from, or why are you so tall? And I had forgotten that my grandfather was like over 6 foot, but he was bedridden this whole 13 years, and so my perception of him was always so small. And I really wanted to embed this kind of like weight of a body or recreation of a body by piecing together these kind of fragments of it in order to create it. And I was also the pallbearer for my grandfather, and so I really wanted to embed these kind of gloves that I use that, like, technically the last physical contact that we have together and kind of embed them within memory and recreating this body. And then the last piece of the show that I really want to talk about is the video piece. This was the first video piece that I've ever made, which was really exciting because so much of my practice is influenced by videos and kind of images and the effect that they have on our society. And one of the things that I found really interesting within the past few years is the tourism within Vietnam. There's been like an increase in tourism that when I went back, I could have probably just went speaking English the whole time without ever having to learn Vietnamese. And I encountered so many people that were expats that were living in Vietnam. They're like, I've been here a decade, but I don't speak Vietnamese. And I was like, that's so interesting dynamically. And I didn't want to be this kind of voyeuristic because in many ways I was also an outsider coming into it, and I didn't want to be this kind of spokesperson for it because I do not have the nuances or the kind of context for a lot of the things. And so as a result, I kind of embedded the language into itself. And so there's this kind of animation that kind of go throughout, and this was also my first attempt at animation, which is so funny. I originally also thought that I was going to be an animator before I went into fiber, but then I was like, there's no way I can draw the same thing 1,000 times. So instead, in my brain, I use a lot of illustrators for my patternings and stuff like that, and so I wanted to translate that within the video. And so I essentially designed this really long panel in Illustrator, and then just clicked like 2 clicks every single time and then export it as a frame. So there was like hundreds of little frames that I kind of went through in order to make this little animation. And then I also combined this kind of letter/poem that I wrote when I was in Vietnam the first time around. There was this huge kind of like dissonance within my sense of identity when I went back, because I had placed so much emphasis on Vietnam being this place that I would feel at home again when I went back. And when I went back, I was an outlier once more. Everything was changed so much, and so much had changed that the first 3-4 weeks, I did not take any photos, that I didn't want to talk about it. I was writing a lot, and I was like, oh my God, if Vietnam is not home, where is home? And so it was really interesting to kind of think about that throughout the work. But at the same time, I was like, I don't want to share this, so it feels very vulnerable to share with an audience so freely. And so in a way, I was like, why don't we ask the audience to work for it? And so this kind of coded motif is the storyline throughout the entire film, where it kind of loops in itself and it doesn't have any linear. It's kind of like segments and moments and intimates within it. And I was really trying to create a sense of place without having to say anything. And so the majority of the video is just audio, kind of your surrounding with sounds that I was surrounded by. And there is like 1 or 2 conversation, but I think those are really interesting. And here's the piece with all the other 2 artists, which I'm really excited about. But thank you so much again for coming to the artist talk, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hello. The first artist talk that I ever gave, I made a compilation video of everything I'd ever made, and I just talked over it, and afterwards everyone was like, I don't even know what I just saw. This is, hopefully I've gotten a little better at it, and I deleted a bunch of slides in a panic before this because I thought it was too long. So, you know, when you try to talk about all of your work and you get really nervous about leaving things out, and you're like, they won't know. So I'm feeling that a little bit right now. But anyways, my mom's house was not dirty, but it was packed with stuff. There was a walkway lined with stacks of magazines and toys. We saw it, but we didn't see it. Stacks of things I couldn't name lived on the dinner table with 3 place settings carved out. When we moved out, the accumulation separated into individual pieces. Suddenly, I was on a mission to save everything I could, because whatever I didn't save would be thrown away and lost forever, and that was completely devastating. Upstairs in my mom's bedroom, she had a king-size bed that took up the room. You could slide inside and spread open the tightly tucked sheets into the cold parts with your legs. The wide window to the right and her Chinese dresser on the left. One time, the sun shifted one of its jade appliques in the shape of a woman. There's a glue mark where it shifted. She'd shown me where it happened as if it were a regular thing. The woman had melted 1/4 of an inch east. I remember grabbing random clothes, mentally apologizing to everything I didn't take, memorizing everything exactly as it was, balanced and condensed. It was all extremely important, but there was no way to save everything. I have dreams about this day a lot, of re-entering the house and my room and the stuff. Parents have the map that seems to fall away the older you get, and you figure out that there are no rules. And I think about trying to make a home and trying to keep a home and discovering the complexity of life and complexity of this as life gets more hilarious and tragic. I think about the moments that repeat themselves throughout your life, like reverberations that come back again. When they come back again, they feel like distortions. Jennifer Allen, in Life Once More, Essays in Reenactment in Contemporary Art, she describes reenactment as always presupposing a missing body. Consider how the term enactment relates to the law, decree, edict, mandate, and to the theater. Dramatization, acting, impersonation. In both cases, a unique body has been replaced by an endless series of bodies that are interchangeable with one another across time and space. Reenactment uses the body as a medium for reproducing the past. Every reenactment is a form of natural history, which is centered upon the comings and goings of human beings. Timelines breaking off create something new, an alternative positioning. In biographies, we can imagine tiny moments of possibility with each memory playing and replaying. Or fictional departures describing something that could have happened. How do I continue to follow the cycles of those before, and how do I diverge from that path? The divergence is the moment the myth is created because a new thing is proposed into existence. It's a kind of like a glitch in biographical narrative to deviate or reinvent. This is a hallway to be entered and exited in both directions, with videos telling gradual versions of my earliest memory, with each time ending differently, but not impossibly. Here are the versions of the story where I thought my dad was leaving my family, but he was really just going to work in the morning. There's mirroring in the form of pairs, iterations, patterns, recurring shapes that reanimate former ideas. I was frustrated with singular objects trying to hold something so enormous as love. Grief doesn't feel austere to me or black and dark. It feels like an orchestra. That's how I came into performance. I was trying to find the activation, and sometimes that's in the body itself and physical motion, and I wanted to play with how the language of presenting something can create a momentum. This had a pull-up bar in the back where I did a pull-up, then slid out of its mouth. I was wondering who the dragon was. Is it me, my mother, or a third thing as a mediator? It's a thing I had to overcome to be outside of my capability. How can I prove myself as someone who has weight and strength and desire and ambition, in the same way that I wanted to challenge the singular object trying to contain everything? I wanted to challenge myself as a material, as the activation, as the urgency. Something representing something else can only pretend to do it. It's not the actual thing. It's performing the traits, the thing, or feeling, or memory's identity. If I was simulating strength, why not my actual physical strength? If I wanted movement, it doesn't need to be implied. I could actually just make something move. This immediacy is where I began to think about the conceptual framework of performance itself and how it functions outside of literal theater. It lives in our interactions and experiments. Objects are props. In this video that I'm not going to play because I was scared about going over, this is just a screenshot of it. I raced my weight down a hill in and out of the sunset, pushed by two ghosts. We had a race down this icy hill with the subtitles were pounds of knowledge that were kind of narrating the whole story. I've been thinking about how it's the performativity itself rather than literal performance, like how that's the actual vehicle for simulation. My body reenacting something, a prop that stands in for something. Humor is the divergence in language. Lauren Berlant's work discusses the relationship, well, among other things, but one of the things she discusses is the relationship between comedy and trauma, seen either as form or as a synonym for history. She argues that comedy and trauma have a formal resonance. Quote, it's a lot about proceeding in brokenness and the relation among different kinds of brokenness. She considered herself talking about the comedic more than comedy itself. And I'm thinking about this idea in addition to how I often imagine forms of performativity over physical performance itself. In this piece, I made a set of dentures using my baby teeth that fit back into my mouth, and then I made this stunt video of me doing these impossible things like kicking a ball around the world or starting a fire with my hands. And it wasn't supposed to be like convincingly like I was doing these things. I think that's something about pretend, right? Like I wasn't trying to like do really cool video effects. I was like, I want this to look like I'm trying to do something, but I want people to know that I'm not actually doing it, which is really just bad editing, and that's kind of just what I did. The footage appeared on a series of birthday cakes that I ate with the dentures, so it was like my past self was consuming the impossible acts of the future and alternate self. In the end, the footage of me eating the cake itself became a cake, and that was flung off a building that I caught at the bottom of the building, and then I ate that cake in like real time. So the real time me like ate it below. I'm interested in how humor is like language doing circus tricks. This piece, you put your head in as my head as a baby, so your arm is hugging yourself as me as a baby. When we had to clean out my mom's house, we found freshly folded laundry on the washer, ready to go, as if she'd just been there. Oh, I have to play this. Does it play on its own?
Oh, I see. I spent more time taking pictures of things in her house than actually cleaning. My brother's like, yeah, you didn't do anything. A set of milkshake spoons, a freezer bag of old cell phones, folders of every report card, drawing, school project. There was a trash bag with all of the socks that we'd ever worn in our entire lives. These are printed out and put into this piece that's in the exhibition. I was really into the mechanism of hinges for a while. I thought they were so cool, like how they actually fit together. So this piece is these modular towers that are stacked, and they're hinged with PVA, then double hinged with broom handles. And then embedded into them in an alternating pattern with aluminum flashing are the images that were cut out, embedded into wax. These clear casts that are behind the towers hold water from the Atlantic Ocean. And there's also a sandcastle. The negatives of the cutouts were used to hold soap casts in the absence of the objects. The film in the exhibition revisited places from my mom's life, something that was wholly about her, but that became more about the relationship between my brother, my aunt, and I. And my mother and her mother kind of became silent fourth and fifth characters. The sculptures in the exhibition kind of are props for the film. If anyone was at the screening last night, I kind of, it wasn't in, I don't know. I think there's a lot of improv in my work, and a lot of the animations in the film came from a lot of the materials that were used to make the sculptures, mostly because I learned a lot about animation working with my friend on this film. And every time we would like go somewhere to be making something, he would be like, we could just animate that. So we just animated a lot of materials that were around, and that became part of the film. And the next slide is the trailer for the film.
Your mother was always holding on to me. Always holding on. Touching me. Always. So here's to the golden moon. And here's. She says, I want to start a new life. I really want to do this. I would go to the theater. I would look for my mother on the screen. Everywhere I went, I looked for her. Yeah, and then we grow up. Makes me happy. Makes me feel fine. Tiny bubbles make me warm all over. With a feeling I'm gonna love you till the end of time.
So this is another piece that's in the exhibition. I kind of spent an entire summer, yeah, like Sydney said, making all these pieces, and all of the work was made between 4 different studios in different states. I had my studio here in Kansas City. I spent some time at Anderson Ranch over spring break, and I was fortunate enough to have all these residency opportunities, but what made it stressful is that I could only bring a certain amount of materials and certain pieces to each place. So I'd be in a place and I'd be like, well, I have to make this piece because there's nothing else I need to be doing. So this was this motif of the clouds. I got really into plasma cutting steel at Anderson Ranch, and I really enjoy making, right? I really enjoy materials and trying to figure out how things fit together.
So I was like, what if what's holding all these up are a bunch of TV remotes? And so I kind of had this battle with someone on Facebook Marketplace for his lot of 18 vintage TV remotes that I sawed apart. So that was really fun. But there's a sequence in the film that is it's an animated sequence where these clouds are used in the animation. So when you watch the film, and I'm also happy to send you a copy of the film if you want to watch it in its entirety, you'll see a lot of relationships of patterns and materials that are also in the sculptures. I think about my friends a lot in my work, how staying up late laughing and thinking about crazy ideas is it's a radical form of research. Like, that's so important. And I think about how these simple things that I think maybe might sound really general are extremely important for being alive. And I always kind of want to emphasize how powerful that is. And I think that's why celebration is such a huge part of my work, because I think that's enormously critical and complex and endless. And the feeling of belonging, to care for and be cared for by others, is a palpable thing. I think about the texture of it and how it grows into making things in the real world, things that are hilarious and amazing and alive. I think about this a lot, and to be up against constructs of impossibility and being able to create your own language. I've collaborated with a lot of my friends in my work. Sometimes in my mind, try to separate work that's like my personal work and work that's collaborative work, but they feed into each other so much aesthetically and through their energies that are very transferable and fluid. So this was a piece I worked on with my best friends, Jordan Wong and William Linzillo. And here we were thinking about performance theater. The audience was the missing body that Jennifer Allen refers to in her analysis of reenactment's functions. Guests can view the collaboratively made supercut film of every time something notably gay happens in the demon hunting television show Supernatural. While they're seated on the stage as a spectator watching the spectacle. So again, it's like subjective, but it became like this language where people that knew what we were talking about, like, this is why pop culture is important, right? Because it's built upon this set of rules or this set of understanding or relatability that we built. And the gay notes were from the show we printed them all out. I mean, we didn't watch all, we really tried. We got like 70% there. We're on the wall adjacent to the work. So I don't know if you can see this, but we had like 5 people watching the show with us. In the comments, like, some of them are as vague as like, at this timestamp, Dean and Sam are dressed as priests, gay. But it was really, like, I think there was something really serious there too. So there's like this thing that relates back to the reenactment, right? To the inside jokes and the real world implications of like white hetero men creating a show about white hetero men for white hetero men, right? When I think about the things that help me understand the world and help me learn joy and sadness and wanting to place myself in the context of history and of a lineage, I think about my mom immigrating to the U.S., attached to her sister who wasn't much older than her. I also think about how I'm really self-conscious about things in my work being labeled stories about immigration, because I think, kind of similar to what Mary said, I'm very protective of that being easily flattened. But also, to repeat myself, there's something about celebration that's really important in my work, because I think about how incredibly like intense that is, right? So when I was making the film, something I was realizing was that the reason why I started doing performance is because I was so bored by just like making things that looked nice. And I started making things with different pieces or multiple pieces or stuff with sound or stuff where like I would just throw a party. I spent a lot of time between undergrad and graduate school like living in Brooklyn and just performing and doing projects with my friends in basements and breweries. I did one in a meadery. I did one at like weird cultural centers, but all stuff that I was just doing things with my friends. And I think it taught me a lot about how important those things are to remember. The longing of that like pulls us forward, right? I think about my mom taking her Baptist name over her birth name and looking for a real home in a place, in a person, and in the impossible span of one lifetime. It gifts us with the incredible ability to do impossible things and imagine something more in a future space, on both the personal and political level. The ability we have to diverge from a path, to reinvent, is to make fiction real life. It's actually power. I want something that feels connected to something bigger than the confines of formality or a description, trying to articulate this feeling of always performing, or complicity being so ingrained with our identities. I remind myself that identities are truly always in a state of fluctuation. I think about the expectation to provide responsibly, to not shop too much online or keep things that should be given away. We exist in time, but the slippage is where the most interesting moments are. I'm really exposing my brother a lot in this presentation. When things come back around in a timely or untimely manner. This is a text conversation with my friend where I was going to buy a bunch of stuff I found online that I used to own. And he was like, that actually happened to me. He was trying to rebuy a pair of shoes that he wanted, and he realized they were reissued as vintage. So he was able to get them. These are screenshots of my dad talking to my dog. This is one of the last texts my mom sent me. This is my dog's paw. These moments of reflexivity, when time bounces back, is a big feeling. I think slowly about this particular tightness in the middle of my body. I think about these small moments of freedom that we hold on to. Because sometimes someone is there and then they aren't, and that's kind of where the mythology begins. Thank you.
Check. Yep, that works. You all stayed exactly on time. I want you to know that. They were very afraid that we were going to go way over time, and we are to the minute how we had outlined. So good work. We're going to now open it up to questions from the audience, but I can start. So be brainstorming some questions that you all have as well. We do have to use the mics when we're asking the questions and answering them for you all, because we are live streaming this and recording it. So when you have a question, Lauren will come to you with another mic for you to ask. But my first question for you all is, oftentimes these Charlotte Street Visual Artist Awards exhibitions are billed as 3 solo shows with each of the 3 artists that were selected. But this time, you all decided that you wanted to do a group show with a joint title. And I was wondering if you could talk about that decision and how you came up with the title, My Mother's Tongue Ties Me Together.
I had a piece where I had a line that was similar to a tongue tying together. And I think I don't know, I think a lot of the suggestions that we had were related to homeland, and I don't think I necessarily identify with this. I was born in the US. So we were trying to think of like a generalization of what the idea of mother or something that we are looking to, or that thing. And I think mother was like sorry, this isn't a good answer, I guess. I don't know why I took the microphone. I don't really know why.
Sorry, I apologize. But I think it was kind of an organic collaboration in many capacity, and I think we were very intentional about knowing that this was the first time that 3 Asian artists were simultaneously picked at the same time, and how the work was going to be read in association with one another. And so we did a lot of little plannings beforehand, thinking about the pieces that we're thinking of making, but not really having any fleshed out idea. And so it was really interesting to see all the work come together and how organic it kind of have thematically together. But I was really interested in the title personally because of the language kind of thing. So much of my work was dealing with translation and thinking about how to interpret that. And my mother tongue is something that I always think about. And I also like that it's kind of as like an icky quality to it. And so there's kind of like a little bit of a humor aspect of it also. Same thing. I feel like I'm just handing the mic down.
Yeah, and it made sense for us three to show together and to have a cohesive show together. I don't know if having like 3 separate solo shows ever really crossed my mind personally, because when we started talking about our work and our practices with one another, there were just so many common through lines that were implicitly in our work that it made sense to present everything together. Like, so much of our work is about dissolving space and place and breaking down barriers, and it didn't make sense to kind of set that up in the gallery in this presentation.
I have more questions, but I want to open it up to you all because there's a lot of folks in this room that might have really good questions as well. I'll ask another one of my questions, which is specific to you, Mary. You talked a lot about recycling your past pieces and incorporating them in new works. And I was curious if you have been brainstorming what you might do with the current pieces, or if you want to show them again in their entirety a couple times before you break them down. But I also know that Mary made over 300 tiles of the ceramic tiles, and I think we only used half of them in the installation. So you have so many more tiles to play with as well. So I was just curious if you've been brainstorming how you might use your pieces in the future.
I'm looking for a good sledgehammer if anybody has one that I can borrow. No, I'm thinking about reconfigurations of this piece in other spaces. When I designed that piece, it was designed specifically for the architecture of the Spencer Museum. When we went and did a site visit, I was really drawn to the 2 large pillars that were in that center gallery, and I wanted to respond to it. And I think there's a lot of room for reconfigurations, right, when you're working with architectural components to kind of fit other spaces and other places. And that whole piece, it actually started with the tiles. I had this idea of wanting to make awnings with these tiles that were formed to different parts of my body, like 2 or 3 years ago. I really like awnings. They're like these like temporary structures for protection. And, I love a utilitarian object. And actually the concrete components, I needed something to hold the tiles. So that's where they came from. But they're the bulk of the work and they're the weight of the work. Yeah, a sledgehammer for Christmas, maybe.
I'll ask you each a question while I'm at it. So, Hung, my question for you is, you talked a lot about in your past work how propaganda is such a big part of how you're exploring those works. And I was curious if propaganda is still present in the current body of work in the galleries, or how you see that some of your past work coming into this new body of work.
I think somewhat, but I was really interested in kind of this idea of how a work is flattened within a museum scene and kind of pushing back against it in any capacity. Reword, not in a museum scene, but just kind of like with seeing in general, and how I think there was a statistic that says like an average amount of time a person spends with a piece of art is like 6 seconds. And I was like, there's no way that you can get anything out of 6 seconds. And so it kind of helped me think about the legibility of a lot of the work, and so much of the information I was thinking about is like, how do we translate information and kind of which form of it? Because I think propaganda is such a loose term in any capacity. It's just sharing an idea or ideology in any capacity. And I think in many ways my work is propaganda because I am sharing my own point of view within that sense. But I think I'm leaning more towards the kind of personal archive of everything and kind of thinking about how to give agency back to the kind of subjects that I'm working with and what kind of form of collaboration can I make out of it.
In some ways, it seems like the opposite of propaganda, because propaganda, you want it to be quick and easily readable, and you're completely changing that. Noelle, my question for you is one that I wanted to ask last night, but we didn't get to it. You mentioned that with the video that you created, the first time you had gone to these places, you had no connection to them. because they were places that you were just now learning about through your aunt and hearing all of those stories. So I was wondering if you feel like you have a connection to those places now. Like, do you feel like you have a connection to that bus stop because you've now heard all of these stories, and does it resonate with you now more than previously, I guess?
Yeah, but they still kind of, I don't know, you still just go somewhere and you're like, I only know this place through the lens of this other person, right? And I know that sounds kind of like ordinary, but I think it was weird making a film that was about someone else's interpretation of places while I was there. And so like I kind of said last night, I got this grant for this, when you just make up a project, you're like, I'm going to apply. And I was like, called my brother and I was like, do you want to just go to California and film stuff about these places Mom lived? And he was like, yeah. And he was like, what are we trying to do? And I was like, I don't really know, but I have this list of these places so we can just go there. So there wasn't really that much structure. And I think what ended up happening is the piece kind of just, like, the film, like, made itself in a lot of ways. I know that sounds like kind of a silly answer, but I think it was weird going to each place and then, like you're really putting yourself in the shoes of this person that isn't there being told. Like, I think there was, like, this character splitting. And then especially because I didn't rewatch the footage for close to a year, rewatching it, I was like, wow, that is so crazy that she said that. And my friend was like, weren't you there when, like, weren't you recording this? I was like, yeah, but so there was so much, like, splitting about, like, what was happening and what time and in what place. So yeah, there definitely is, to answer your question, but it still feels like the removal of my actual first experience is, like, because my first experience is just someone else's, like, third experience. So yeah, that's my answer.
Open it up to questions from the audience again. Lauren, right here.
Thank you all for discussing your work and answering these questions. Are really interesting. I was struck by how the immaterial is made present in all three of your work and how that comes through thought. But Noelle, I was curious, when you think of the ecstatic, do you think that is that a feature in your work that you think about directly?
Yeah, I think about the energy of the work, like, all the time. Like, that's something where, I don't know, like, how do you know, when you're just, like, so excited about something and you really want someone to understand how exciting that is, it's like that's the challenge, it feels like, when I'm like, I want someone to really know how exciting this is. And I think that's why there's so much magic in making work, is because, yeah, I mean, it's hard to make work. Like, you hate yourself most of the time. But then, like, the magic of it is when you're like, I think I did it. I think that is here. I think there is something that's, like, powerful about it. And I think with this film, it was one of the first times I really thought, like, wow, I think I managed to touch all of these places, you know? And like I was talking about, I'm never like, sometimes I am, but most of the time I'm not setting out to do a performance, right? It's just like, well, then I could actually just be doing this, right? And it becomes more and more complicated, and that's where I feel like all of these separate parts can make it feel more, I don't know, immediate and urgent. So when you say the ecstatic, I just think about, like, all the fun you have and all that discovery that you have in trying to make something present. Yeah, I mean, last night I was talking about it more in terms of, like, the rhythm of work. I think about the rhythm a lot and how someone will be carried through it, and the pacing of it, even if it's, like, a single sculpture. I think that's really important for me, is, like, the rhythm of how it sits in the room, you know? And there was something strange about making the film because I was still thinking about it, but now that this was actually durational, I was able to like like play with rhythm in the way that I think it normally would be interpreted.
I'm really fascinated about all three of you and how you collaborate with your audiences through text, spatial audio, and then with Noelle, I believe, at least the way I've interpreted it, is like you can go up to the piece and like use your eyes and like find a tiny photograph. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the experience of setting up the installation and like the process of like the lens of childhood specifically with Noelle, but I think you all have a lens of childhood, so if you could talk to that.
I think I stopped being really precious about my work, and so if I thought something was funny, I would ask myself why I thought it was funny, and that's something I ask my students a lot too, because they'll just be like, "That's so funny." I'm like, "Why do you think that's funny?" And then like no one can figure it out. I'm like, "Well, there's a reason why it's funny, is because it's so weird." And I think about like the things that I liked when I was little, I still really like, and still informs the way that I really like similar things now. And I just really lean into it a lot. And when I install stuff, yeah, I just bring, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer. Do you have a better answer? Okay, Mary has a similarly good answer.
Yeah, I think about the audience as like an activating component in the work. I think about my work as compositional infrastructures. So then so they're just like stages for compositions to take place, but they have to be activated for any composition to really occur or for any change in the system to be affected. And, you know, when somebody is interacting with the work, sometimes this like childlike wonder really does come out, where you can let your guard down a little bit and just relax and have some fun. And you know, that's hard to do sometimes when you're an adult, so I'm appreciative that I can facilitate that through my installations.
I have a really hard time of being kind of playful within my practice. I'm like a very structural person. I like to see patterns and I like to see grids, and I like these ways that I can contain myself. But I think with the laser engraver and the indigo having a mind of its own, I think that's where I've been trying to be more playful and leaning into these kind of quote unquote mistakes that I always think. In school, my professor described me as anal, and I think that stuck with me so much, where I was like, I am very anal about a lot of things. And so it's like I like the meticulous process, and I think for me that seems very playful. And then also, I like puzzles a lot, and so like asking the audience to kind of decode this kind of puzzle that I've kind of given them is really fun. And I even have a hard time kind of decoding it sometimes, so for myself, I like to have that kind of little playful, but I think it's hard for me to play within my work, because I think about that almost too seriously sometimes. So
I have a better answer. Okay, so I was thinking about it during the time they were talking. So something I don't really talk about in my talks, because is like how material my work is, and I really love like figuring out how to make things. Like that's so much fun for me. But I also go into projects from a super, I mean, this isn't unique for the three of us, but like from an extremely labor-intensive perspective, like I really love building, and I really love things that take a lot of time. And so sometimes that fabrication element is like, that's the headache and like that's the nightmare. But then I think the rest of it is like, oh, then I'm having fun after that. I'm like, I died the past 3 weeks trying to figure out how to get this thing to work. And so I kind of just like, I collect a lot of things too. So then there's like moments where I'm like, oh, now I can kind of have fun, you know? And I think it took me a long time to give myself permission to do that, because especially when I was in like undergrad, every 5 seconds I was like, is this a good idea? And then you realize at the end of school, I realized at the end of undergrad that like, you can just do whatever you want. Like, no, and that was like so relieving for me to understand, which it's like no one told me that I couldn't do that. But I think when I realized that, I just started really, that's when I moved to New York and I started doing these performances. It didn't make any sense, because I was like, I can do whatever I want. And so now when I make my sculptures or think about my projects, it's like, I set them up like, okay, these are the things I have to do. Like, I want it to be this kind of base, or figure out a process that's like this, but then I really kind of just let myself have fun when I'm doing a lot of other parts of it. Like I think about this, again, like the energy and the rhythm, and those things are kind of that's like the release or like the silence or the breath for me. That was better, okay.
Probably be our last two questions.
Hi. I have a question for Noelle. Your usage of pop culture in your work, it's often more like a vehicle or a tool to get somewhere else. So I guess I'm kind of curious how you determine what pop culture references, imagery is like worth investigating or highlighting in your work.
That's a really good question that I've never gotten asked before, and I think a lot of things are really funny. Like I just think there's so many things that are so funny, and I think that's like that's art, right? Where I'm like how can you bend your mind around? I sometimes when I think about what makes something funny, it's something that like you can't really understand, right? Like memes. And so when you try to understand what they are, they're funny because you're like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. And so I think a lot of times like the subtleties in pop culture that kind of follow that similar formula, like that like it show up in everyday life too. I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, this is the only example I can think of. But there was a point when like we were on the research trip when we were in California, and my aunt asked my brother. I keep just like exposing him, but it was really funny because she just painted her nails, and she was like, "Colin, what do you think about my nails?" And he was like, "I think they look good." But she had painted them the same color as her skin, so he didn't know what he was looking at. And I was just like, there's something like that kind of stuff happens in like TV where I'm like, this is art. Like that's like the funniest, like I was like crying. I was like, Lena, like he doesn't know what you're asking him. And like it wasn't, and there's things like that. Like I think because I think so many things are funny, I'm like that has to be somewhere. Like someone else has to know that this thing exists, right? And I think that's what makes me like really excited. And I think that's also what kind of balances the extreme sadness that I find really important in the work to carry it, right? Because like those things work together. And but yeah, especially the supernatural piece, it was like more of film that my friend kind of thought of, and we kind of jumped on it with like fabrication and sculptures. But it was like seeing how people were actually interpreting what they were taking notes on was really fascinating, and it was kind of this study in like something really weird. But does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you all for sharing. It was so lovely to hear and get so much more insight on your work. It was really fascinating. This is kind of for everybody, kind of circling back to the idea of labor. I think there is so much labor in all of your works in really different ways, but there's also this sense of impermanence to each one of them, whether it's performance, whether it comes through the destruction at the end of the piece, or even thinking about the limited time span of fiber. And I was just wondering if that's something like you're all thinking about, or if there's something you want to mention about
that. Yeah, there's a lot of labor in my work. I think my practice is maybe very Sisyphean, just, pushing a large boulder up a hill over and over and over again. But in my case, it's bricks. And that's the part of the work that I don't talk about too much, but it's really important to me. Like, there are ways that I could make my pieces that would make them less labor intensive and less individual, but for some reason I don't do them. And so I think it's important for me that like my sweat and my tears go into the fabrication process. And with the case of the work across the street, also my partner Mitch's, who was helped me with a lot of the fabrication because I threw out my back immediately in the casting process. Yeah.
I also think about labor a lot within my work, and one of the reasons I kind of love these slow and kind of like very tedious processes is it forces me to spend more time with an image. And it kind of goes back to kind of the time when I was researching, where I was consuming so many images where I did not give any of them the intentionality that it deserved. And so especially when I was working with family photographs, when I stumbled upon that archive, I felt like I was like, oh my God, this is gold. And so I was like looking through them so often that I was like forgetting them. And so as a result, these kind of embroideries and kind of technique that I kind of go back into the images is like a way of editing and obscuring and also kind of like talking to the past. And so I really like to think about kind of like them as a person who I'm kind of working with in any capacity. And the ephemeral question, that is something that I struggle with a lot. I'm a person that forgets a lot, and so I really want everything to be like permanent. And so like within my undergrad and even after graduating, I really wanted to make things that would last forever. And I was like thinking about archival stuff and like that, but as I was like, this is fiber hung. You've ripped it like 3 times since transporting it, and like it's not gonna last that long comparatively. And I think that release was so kind of nice in many ways, that like nothing is permanent and anything that I can do will kind of just one day disappear just like I will. But I also just think, not in like a morbid sense, but I just think that it's like there's this kind of beauty to it, that like we leave our mark in these kind of impermanent ways and kind of like these little echoes throughout time, that like we don't remember everyone that's ever lived, but I think the kind of evidence that they had existed is something that we kind of go back to. And I love that kind of little existence of like little moments in time that you kind of encounter there, like someone was here, like carving on a tree, like a little rock or something like that. Like I love collecting things in that kind of same capacity, but it's something that I think about a lot within my work, of how, if it's gonna last or if it will at all. So
My answer, I think, is in 2 parts that I'll make really quick. The first is that I never thought I was good at making things. All through school, I was like, I don't know how to do anything. And so whenever I mean, that also took a lot of getting over, right? And I think that, like, I held myself back mentally a lot, along with, like, is this a good idea? Like, my old roommate was, like, so tired of hearing me ask him that, like, every single day. But it's something where, like, when I want to figure out how to do something, and it's like I'll ask my friend that knows how to do it to help me make the thing, right? And that's something that I really, like, I ask for help, like, all the time. Like, I love asking for help. I'm like, hey, you know how to do this. Can you like help me figure this out? And that's something that, like, I want to, like, learning those new skills is like, that's so fun for me, where I'm like, oh, there's something that can help me do this, right? Or like somebody that can help me do this. And so I think about labor in that way, where I'm like, I can, like, if I don't know how to do something, you know, I don't like feeling helpless. I don't like feeling people are burdened to help me, but there's something where it's like I can learn, right? And when I think about all the things I do know how to do, especially because I teach, right? And my students think I know everything, and I'm like, I still don't think I know anything, right? And that's, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the other aspect of it too is that I'm always kind of torn between like equating, I mean, I think there's some just subconscious like chip on my shoulder that I'm sure many of you have, is that the labor that goes into something is equated to the success that it has in the world. And I think sometimes I argue with myself about that. Like, I think, like, I want something that's like this, and I want to really work on it, and I want to really make it this certain way. But at the same time, like, when I have an open studios or a studio visit and I set up my studio in like 20 minutes, I'm like, this looks incredible. And I just like stacked stuff and did like lean something at a certain angle, and I'm like, this is the coolest sculpture I've made in like all month, right? And so I try to hold on to those moments, those like the quick making too, because I'm like, I'm not thinking as hard. And I don't know, I guess full disclosure, every year my flat file piece, Marcus, I make that right before I send it. And every time I do that, I'm like, this was so good. Like, I'm like this year I literally just printed out a piece of paper with something that I wrote, and I had Cooper just like put it in a folder, and I was like, it's flat, right? And I was like, that was genius, right? But it's like moments where I like actually don't stress out over it, and I don't care as much about it. Not care as much, but like, okay, making it sound really bad. But when I'm like, I think I'm constantly reminded that when I let go those, like trying to make something perfect or precious, like it's also really amazing. And so I think back to the earlier question, when I give myself those freedoms to, like have fun in my work, like those things are also really critical decisions that have a lot of information, and I try to give myself credit for that.
Thank you all so much for telling us more about your practice and the works that you have in the exhibition. Throughout the whole process, we've talked about all of the similarities between your work, whether it's visual. All of you had clouds, and that was not planned at all. We just noticed it. But materiality, things we talked about today, sadness, loss, family history, memory, and also celebration. They're so personal, but they are also so much bigger than yourselves. So I want to thank you for putting on this wonderful exhibition. I want to invite everyone to join us across the street for a reception with some snacks. And I also want to offer you all a copy of Shaped by the Gravity of Others, A Reflection on My Mother's Tongue Ties Me Together. This is an essay by Alex Pike, who was one of the jurors for the Charlotte Street Visual Artist Awards this year. He lives in LA. And the artist asked him to write a reflection on the exhibition. So we have packaged it in this nice little booklet for you all, attendees of this program, to receive. I will put the stack closer to the doors over there so you can grab one on your way out. And I hope to see you across the street shortly. Thank you again.